Hello. Yeah. So good morning, everyone. So it's a great pleasure to be here in ICTS, my first visit here, and so beautiful. I was telling Joby and Collins today that I wish we had such institutes when we were in college. We were about to get into college, right? It was quite exciting. So thanks to Neelima and the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure. So I'll talk about some of the work we've been doing on modeling oscillators, oscillator networks the last couple of years. So my lab is called Laboratory for Computational Neuroscience. So our big goal is to build a simplified model of the whole brain. We call this hypothetical model the mesobrain because it's not macro, not micro, meso, middle level. Because at this level, we want to model the brain capturing all its main structures. So you'll have the sensory inputs climbing up, the motor outputs climbing down, the prefrontal areas for decision making, and the three major loops, basal ganglia, hippocampus, and cerebellum. It's a tall order. I mean, anybody who knows anything about neuroscience will say that this is, come on, give me a break. But we've been trying to, instead of launching one grand project which will construct everything with an $100 million kind of budget, we've taken pieces of it and building different pieces over the years. So basal ganglia is where we spent a lot of time, almost 15 years, and we have kind of a unified model of basal ganglia which can explain a lot of symptoms of basal ganglia, both in normal conditions and Parkinsonian disease conditions. We've also done some work on hippocampus and spatial navigation, again, a unified model which can explain a lot of spatial cells of hippocampus. Then some work on vision, then eye movements, not speech, but birdsong work a little bit. What we have done with Neelima, then motor function, prefrontal decision making. So the pieces are being accumulated. I have 8 years to go before my retirement, so hopefully by that time we hope to build this whole brain model. So to this end, I divided the lab into teams. So each team works on one focused goal with this, which is one of these pieces. And today I'm going to talk about the work of the neural oscillators team. So we know neurons communicate with each other using electrical signals. So we already have an excellent introduction of what is an LFP and what are spikes and all that. So basically, if you record from a single neuron, you have these spikes of action potentials. And the big question again is what is neural code? So here there are two current theories. One is a spike code, another is a rate code. So in spike code, basically the idea is that since the action potential shape is pretty much standard, only the spike time is important. Whereas in the rate code, people say that if you just take the local frequency, that's enough. And so based on these two approaches to understand neural code, you have two different kinds of neuron models, a rate-coded neuron, spike neuron model. Rate-coded neurons have become quite popular in the AI community, just basically neural networks community, and you have sigmoidal, ReLU, and LSTM type of neuron models. And using that, you can construct large networks, very powerful. And we know the whole how the AI revolution is panning out today. The spike neuron models, again, you have a whole lot of them. You have simple single variable models to a very powerful Izikevich two variable model to, unfortunately, standard, one of the first models, to much more detailed biophysical models. So I think since it's a neuroscience group, I don't need to really elaborate on all these different kinds of models. So now that leaves us with a big question, right? So on one side, you have, if you take biophysical neuron models, you have single neurons modeled by like 500 compartments. Some of these kind of models exist. They're very detailed. You can simulate them on neuron and all that, so on neuron simulator. On the other hand, you have these rate-coded neuron models with which you construct large networks with trillions of parameters, and they're literally revolutionizing life on Earth, right, as we know it. So, but you have to understand brain, right? What is that sweet middle spot? What is the right abstraction at which you want to model brain so that you can understand its internal functions and also link it to behavior? So that's a big question, and nobody knows what that sweet spot is. So one cue from engineering that we can take in this regard is, engineering, suppose you're studying fluid flow, right? Nobody talks about fluid as a bunch of molecules, colliding and all that. So invoke this abstraction called fluid, where a fluid element is a lots of, Avogadro, order of Avogadro number type of number of molecules. But then that doesn't make it vague. You have a very rigorous way of describing fluid at that level at that abstract level. And you can design your aircraft wings and ships and all that in a kind of reliable span of time. Whereas if you take this approach that fluid is a bunch of molecules pushing around, then it'll take forever to design your aircraft wing. So we need to find that sweet spot to be able to come up with large-scale brain models, and that's a big question. So that sweet spot could be the local field potential, which Anna just talked about. That instead of recording from single neuron, you shove an electrode kind of in a neighborhood of neurons and take average activity. And also throw away this high frequency component like the spikes from that, like what is shown here. So you get a smoother signal, which is called local field potential. And people have been using not LFE exactly, but because you can have this kind of a gross ensemble signals at multiple scales. So like, for example, if you record EEG from scalp or even from the cortex, right, you will have this and then filter that signal in various bands. And people have given names to these bands like, delta, theta, alpha, and so on. Have given certain information significance. What is the meaning of this band? What happens in the brain in this band? So that's a very old, because EEG is like 100-year-old technology. So people have given all these names, but it's still quite empirical. There is no grand theory of oscillations, which will tell you why is gamma used for this purpose, why is theta used for this purpose, why is whatever. So there's kind of a unified theory of oscillations, which will tell you why the brain uses oscillations in whatever way you are using. What we have is a lot of empirical stuff. So there's a need for some kind of a grand theory of neural oscillations. So I just cite here again a famous paper by Bazaki and Dragoon. Synchronous activity of oscillator networks is now viewed as that critical middle ground. So if you are seeking that middle ground, that sweet spot, talk in terms of synchronized oscillations, right? That's where the secret seems to be. And oscillators are becoming popular in not only in neuroscience, in the neural network community, they're becoming popular even in the artificial neural network community for a whole different reason. Because von Neumann, who's called the father of modern computing, has proposed back in the 50s that if you construct computer hardware using oscillators, that will be more energy efficient. So instead of representing binary information in terms of DC levels of a potential, right, high and low, use oscillatory phase to represent binary information. So something like 0 is 0, 0, and pi is 1 or something like that. In fact, he even is supposed to have taken a patent on that from 1954. So had we developed computer technology using oscillatory elements, we would have had very different computers now. They would look more brain-like, right? But somehow we didn't go in that trajectory. But now people are getting back to that. There's a very nice review by Sava and Parod, shown here. So where they talk about using oscillator electric circuits, electronic circuits to do computing. So basically, they're trying to reproduce some neural network models using hardware oscillators. So now, if you look at this there's also two variable oscillator models, which are actually used in dual purpose. Sometimes these oscillations signify single action potentials, sometimes signify an ensemble activity, and people have been using both ways. So such oscillator models, there is Wilson-Cohen model, Fujinogoma model, which is a reduced version of Horton-Huxley model, Morris-Lacard model. Van Pol is much simpler, more abstract oscillator model used in extensively engineering to model all sorts of oscillations. So, right. So what we'll do is start this as starting point and a limit cycle oscillator model, and from that we'll construct networks. Because instead of taking some biological phenomena and trying to fit a model to that, let us try to create a whole framework of oscillator networks and then apply them to whatever phenomena and see if it is a universal and a kind of integrative frame. That's the approach, and we hardly got there. So limit cycle is different from, as you know, from a harmonic oscillator because it has the trajectory always tends to a particular closed loop. And so this is a harmonic oscillator, whereas we'll take a simple example of limit cycle oscillator, the Hopf oscillator. So these are the equations of the Hopf oscillator. If you convert them, looks slightly scary with cubic nonlinearity and all, but if you convert them in polar coordinates, it's very simple. R, from this dynamics, you can see that R tends to 1, and theta is simply a rotor, right? So it keeps going round and round the unit circle. And what is nice about Hopf oscillator is that you can combine these two equations in terms of x and y into a complex number and write the dynamics in complex form. This is quite critical to construct networks, right, as I'll show you soon. So this is the equation in the complex form. You can show again that it's consistent with these previous equations. So now agenda is like this. So using Hopf oscillator as the basic element, sorry.
What's usually called the Stewart-Landau
Yeah. But at some place people call it hop. I don't know who is. People also call it hop oscillator. Yeah, correct. The same thing. Yes. In physics papers, it's typically called. Yeah. So the agenda is this: using this kind of oscillator as a basic element or a basic sort of neuron model. We want to literally redo the entire neural network theory, at least the popular models, right? And then see what they give you. So oscillatory Hopfield networks, the thing is it's already done. It's a very old stuff, and they don't work very well. That's a different matter. Oscillatory autoencoders like a feed-forward network, oscillatory self-organizing maps, oscillatory deep networks, oscillatory convolution networks. So in fact, this slide is a bit old, but now we have done all this. Not just the first two, but all five are now done. So let us start with a single hop oscillator. So it has a resonant property, like you expect it to have a resonant property. This is from Kim and Larch. So the x-axis is the frequency difference. So you give it a complex sinusoid as an input. The oscillator has its own intrinsic frequency. Let's say omega naught. Input is omega. So difference between these two is capital omega. So as you vary the input frequency, the oscillator shows highest response when two frequencies match. It's a resonant property. And there's frequency locking only for a small range of the difference. If you go out of that range, then there's no frequency locking. And okay. So this is a very basic result. Now let's start with constructing networks. So let's start with a pair of oscillators, which is very easy to study. So take two oscillators, both have same frequency, and there's a feed-forward feedback coupling. And coupling here is, because I'm using the oscillators in complex domain, I'll use the connections also in complex domain, complex numbers. But let's start with real first. So here the coupling is symmetric. So positive coupling, 0.5 symmetric. And if you run them for some time, the both phases synchronize and phase difference becomes zero. Whereas if you start with coupling, a negative coupling, symmetric again, the phase difference goes to pi. Okay, so what we can in fact easily show that if the coupling is symmetric and positive, it's always zero. For coupling is symmetric negative, it's always pi. That's kind of sad because we want to construct a general network. Because ultimately we want to make it look like a brain model, whole brain model. Whereas if you take two oscillators and couple them, you only get 0 or pi. That's very restrictive. You should be able to get any arbitrary phase difference. So how do you do that? Just make use of the fact that the coupling is a complex number. So if you do that, then you can easily show that this is a complex coupling. Only thing is it's symmetric but conjugate, right? They form conjugate pairs because the matrix becomes a Hermitian. Then you can easily show that the angle of that coupling phi is equal to the phase difference psi. Okay, it's a very simple algebra. So here we take a coupling with where the angle is pi by 4 and then run the pair of oscillators. After some time, the phase difference goes to pi by 4. So this actually, we thought we discovered this, but it's already there. And there's an excellent book on oscillator networks by Izikevich and Hoppenstadt, right? And that book gives you this derivation. So, okay, so then we went on to try, okay, how do you relax this further? Because in the previous example, we were able to get any arbitrary phase difference, but still the two oscillators have the same frequency, which is restricted. Because brain operates at something like 0.1 hertz to say a few hundred hertz. I mean, that's the kind of network you want. That's the kind of diversity in frequencies you want. So then let us move on a little bit and take two oscillators with different frequencies, but they're close, right? Then what happens? So then we know from again Strogat's level of like dynamics that if we just force them with a strong coupling factor, they can force them to come to a common frequency, right? And then they'll have a constant phase difference. But the problem is in the process they lose their frequency diversity. They come to a common frequency. We don't want that. They want to stay at their whatever frequencies they have and come to some kind of a stable phase relationship. So this is fine, right? But I mean, so here in this numerical example, you see the oscillators are at 2 and 2.2. And when you force x-axis the coupling factor, as you keep increasing coupling factor at some frequency, at some coupling factor of 0.2 or so, they come to a common frequency of 2.1, and then they have a constant phase difference. Typically, the faster oscillator leads the slower oscillator. This is all again well-known stuff. Now, what happens if you take two oscillators with arbitrarily different frequencies? Now, I mean, whole hell breaks loose already. It gets very complicated. So you take two oscillators, right? Omega 1, frequency omega 1, omega 2. Let us take the ratio of the frequencies omega 1 by omega 2. Let's say one of them is fixed at 1, another one you're varying. You look at the ratio. So then the x-axis is that ratio and y-axis is the coupling strength. Now let us look at the neighborhood of ratio 1. So oscillators like before, oscillators are not exactly the same, frequencies are not the same, but close. So ratio is close to 1. So like in previous case, we have seen that if you increase the coupling strength to a point, then they come to a common frequency, they synchronize. So that's what we are showing here, right? If let's say the ratio is 1.1, you have a sufficiently strong coupling strength, then they synchronize, they go to a 1:1 frequency. So that's called synchronization regime. So now if you have something like 3:2 ratio, then again if you use a sufficiently strong coupling strength, so let's say it's 1.5, right? So let's say 1.672 or something, that's the actual ratio. If you sufficiently strong coupling strength, it will go to 1:5, the simple integral ratio in terms of frequencies, and it will have a constant, not a phase difference, but I'll show you it's called normalized phase difference. So this is called entrainment. So you see that to make the two oscillators behave, so that they can have a stable phase relationships, right? It's so hard, and then the numbers I'm showing here are simple integral ratios, but actually you can do this for any rational number. So the map looks really weird. So these are called Arnold tongues, a really scary map. So it's so hard to make nonlinear oscillators work together and produce something reliable, deterministic. So how do we deal with this problem? So we said, let's try a small trick, right? So all that we want is, since you cannot have phase difference, constant phase difference, it is only meaningful to try to get a constant normalized phase difference. That is, you take θ1 by ω1 minus θ2 ω2. That difference is normalized phase difference. Can we construct a pair of oscillators, couple them in such a way that the normalized phase difference is constant, any desired constant? That's the best you can even ask for. And that can be done quite trivially. And we found that is not the literature unless there's some book where it is deeply hidden. It's like the idea is very simple. So basically, if you have two oscillators, this is at ω1, this is ω2. This is sending out its signal at ω1. Let's say ω1 is a low frequency, this signal like this. And ω2 is a high frequency. At the connection, right, when it is transmits the signal over to the other oscillator, you imagine something happens in the connection by which this frequency ω1 gets transformed to frequency ω2 instantaneously. Okay, so that the receiving oscillator will only get to hear the ω2 frequency signal. So there's no problem of entrainment or anything. In the reverse direction, same thing is expected to happen. So this high frequency signal at the connection immediately changes to low frequency, and that's what is heard by the first oscillator. So both are happy. The same thing, imagine happening over a network, right? ω2 is the oscillator is at ω2 frequency. It's getting inputs ω1 and ω3, but both these signals get instantaneously transformed to ω2. And what this oscillator ω2 receives is on ω2 frequency. There's no problem of any entrainment or anything. How can you achieve this? A very simple algebra. So I have a signal Z1, right, which is equal to A1 and e power I ω1t. How do you change it to ω2 frequency? Raise it to the power ω2 by ω1, which is quite trivial, right? And so that's what we do here at the coupling at the junction, right? Sort of the synapse. You assume that what happens is Z1 power ω2 by ω1. That's what goes into Z2. The reverse direction, Z2 is raised to ω1 by ω2, the real power, and then that's what is sent to the other oscillator. So if you do this, what happens? So you write the coupling, this special form of coupling, we call it the power coupling, because you raise the state to a certain real power to do this kind of coupling. And it turns out the algebra is so simple. When you do this, you can show that the normalized phase difference is equal to, so the coupling constant W12 and W21, they're of the form, there's a special form, e power I phi by ω2, and it's not simply conjugate symmetry. There's a more complicated kind of term. And when you do that, you can link that phi value to this psi, normalized phase difference. Okay, so you can show using numerical simulations that it works, right? And this becomes this, their intrinsic frequencies, So no, not current. Those numbers, those constant numbers only. We are not actually measuring this thing.
What is the objective over here?
Objective is to construct a network, a general network, where the oscillators have great range of frequencies, intrinsic frequencies, and that network should be able to capture brain dynamics. So you take EEG or fMRI or something. This network, let's say, of few hundred oscillators.
Want them to have
That frequency maintained. Yeah, while maintaining that frequency. So omega 1 could be something, omega 2 is something. Now they are coupled. When they don't come to any common frequency or anything, they keep oscillating at omega 1, omega 2.
But there is some constant phase difference.
That normalized phase difference is equal to some desired value which I specified. You can achieve that with this when frequencies are the same by playing with the complex coupling factor. That's what I shown before. When frequencies are the same, that's trivial. But even when frequencies are different, there's a different kind of coupling that you can do. Yeah. With this, you will get the normalized phase difference is equal to one parameter of the coupling coefficient, which is this. This is a coupling coefficient. This is stable.
Not assuming rational relation.
No, any real frequencies. Yeah, anything. At least the proof doesn't require rational frequencies, rational frequency ratio. But I expect some problems, but in numerical simulation so far we never saw any problems. I don't know, theoreticians might study with their tweezers and find some problems, or which might. I'll tell you what that is. Because the thing is, when you raise a complex number to a real power, I mean, all the problems of Riemann surfaces and all, even with the z power root 2, right, is z per half basically. The complex analysis textbook tells you, huge like construction and all that. Yeah. So if you have a, let's say, rational power, I mean, what does it even mean? How do you construct? So I don't know. We didn't get into all that. We just wrote the code in MATLAB and it gives beautiful results. Okay. It's an engineering approach. Whatever works is what is practical. In that sense, I'm in AA department. Okay, so now the reviewer said, I mean, what the hell are you guys talking about? And what is the meaning of this? Is this biology and brain doesn't work like this? Then we told them a story that, look, what's actually happening in the brain in neural interactions is something like this. Only thing is, don't look at single synapses and single neurons, but look at the neural ensembles. And therefore, if you're talking about coupling between two neural ensembles, you're talking about a whole bundle of synapses, not single synapse. So we gave some kind of interpretation. So imagine these are all slightly higher frequency neurons, both excitatory and inhibitory, and they're balanced so that their spike trains are slightly desynchronized, so that the average activity gives you a nice oscillation. Similarly, these are like lower frequency neurons, again, same construction. And they're coupled by a whole bundle of synapses. Then you can easily imagine by playing with the synaptic time constants and thresholds and everything, I can transform a high frequency signal to a low frequency signal. That's trivial. And that's happening instantaneously at the synapse, meaning at a very short time scale. So something like that is what our power coupling is representing. This is what we told, and the reviewer bought that story, and the paper was published. Okay. So that lays the foundation to figure out how to couple two oscillators and produce something, a reliable phase relationship. So next, now let's slowly talk about training. How do you train this? And how do you construct larger networks? So training at level of single oscillator means there's only one parameter there, which is the frequency. How do you train it? So when you give a complex sinusoid as input, how do you make the oscillator learn that frequency? So this is called frequency tracking in EE literature, signal processing literature. So that's actually there's a very simple rule for that published before by Rigetti et al. And we are just following a complex version of that. So if you apply that, you see that the original oscillator is at 40 radians per second initially. Input signal is at 30. So keep on presenting that signal for some time and let the oscillator learn. The oscillator's frequency tracks the input signal frequency and then matches with it. So that's what you see here, the oscillator frequency. One interesting thing here is the way it learns. So normally in this kind of learning results, you find the learning parameter to approach the desired value asymptotically. It looks like this. But here it's actually is dipping and then literally crashing into that final value. I don't know why this happens, but interesting. So we showed how to train single oscillator and its frequency. We showed how to couple to a pair of oscillators. Now let us take a whole network of them and show how you can learn some arbitrary time series. So you have a network of these oscillators. Now instead of just 2, I have n of them and coupled by a n by n matrix of complex numbers with power coupling. And so now then I take these outputs of all these oscillators, take linear sum of them, and then I want this output that's linear sum to approximate some unknown time series. So there's a bunch of learning equations. I'm not showing them all here. It's in the paper. So this learning happens in stages. First, you train all the frequencies of the oscillators. So we do that here. So in the oscillator frequency initialized by random values. The histogram of the frequencies is pretty much almost flat. Now the input signal has only 3 frequencies. Omega 1 is this, 3, 7, and 11. So when you train the frequency of the network on this kind of a sinusoidal composite sinusoidal signal, at the end of training, all frequencies are bunched up in these 3 bands, close to 3, 7, and 11. Okay, so network is learning your input signal frequencies. After that, you train the lateral connections and forward connections, and you can see that here you're training 2 signals, and so I think red is the desired and blue is actual or something like that. So you see, it's a very good match. It learns very well. It is a toy problem. Let us look at a harder problem. So we said, since we wanted to model this model to look like a real brain model, so why not model brain signals like EEG, for example? Second, we've done the same thing. We took 6-channel EEG and trained this. You see that the output of the network, the 6 outputs, it matches the signal both in time domain like this and even frequency domain, captures the spectrum pretty well. And like what you would expect as the number of oscillators is increased, right? The fit approximation of the network also improves. Error goes down as you expect. So basically what the network is doing is some kind of a Fourier decomposition, a Fourier reconstruction of the input signal. Only thing is these are not, and it happens by training, right? Now let us go further. Now this is actually the whole basis of the whole class of models which are being constructed in this project called the Virtual Brain Project. I don't know how many of you have heard. So it's in University of Marseille, France. There's a group doing excellent work on modeling brain function at large scale using networks of oscillators. They use all kinds of oscillators. I mean, Pujio Nogumo, Hop, Wilson Kovan, and so on and so forth. The thing is, the way they train that network is by using some kind of optimization. So you have the brain signals and then optimize this whole network and figure out what are the connection strengths that will make the network reproduce the measured signals. Whereas in our case, the learning rules are all bio-inspired. You can justify them saying that, so for example, the lateral coupling strengths are trained using some kind of a complex Hebbian learning, right? And I can give even deeper justification and comparison of that with STDP, track time dependent plasticity, which is time dependent or sequence dependent plasticity, right? That kind of plasticity and our complex Hebbian, I can show you has some connection because it has real part, imaginary part, and all that. So one big dichotomy you face when it comes to this kind of large-scale brain models, which is not yet solved, and I think we have a solution, is that these large-scale brain models, they can capture brain dynamics, but they cannot learn input-output behavior. Whereas if you look at the AI models like a convolutional neural network, they can learn input-output. You can classify an image or something, but cannot capture brain dynamics. So if you take a CNN or a convolutional neural network, and if you probe the activity of hidden neurons, it doesn't look anything like the real brain. It's very artificial. So can the same model have both features? Can it have the rich dynamics of brain internally? And can it also learn to solve problems like, classify images and, move a robotic arm, things like that? Can the same model do both? This is a problem. And I think our models can do this. But in the literature, it's still an unsolved problem. Okay, so to get to model real-world brain data, so we began with the EEG, some bunch of EEG work. So this data was shared by Sujit Vijayan at Virginia Tech. He gave us a bunch of EEG data in waking and various sleep states, REM, NREM, and NREM1, NREM2, and all that. So this time we use a slightly different architecture. In the previous case, the architecture is very simple. You have a bunch of oscillators and take linear sum of them, and then that's your output. So now between the oscillators and the output, we put a hidden layer of sigmoidal neurons or tannage neurons, like in a neural network, and train this network again using some kind of a complex backprop algorithm. The fit becomes the order of magnitudes, error goes down by an order of magnitude. So it's very accurate. Similarly, we have done similar stuff even with fMRI data, again, large scale, like 160 zones or what's called regions of interest. Here, the architecture is slightly different. So you have, these are the oscillators. And for each oscillator, I have a hidden layer and then one output. That output of the network has to match one trace in the fMRI readout. And again, you can see that in this case, you can't even see the difference between the actual signal and the estimate. Yeah. So we are just training the network to reproduce some measured signals, that's all. No, so the network is, so the input to the network, input layer is oscillators. And these are transformed by one hidden layer and then the output. And the output is supposed to produce the real brain signals. You train it to do that. And then do a bunch of tests on that to see how valid it is and so. No, random. Sorry? Yeah. Random initial conditions of the network, and then you train the network. Yeah. Yes. Right. So, okay, the frequencies are in a certain range, like some 0 to 40 hertz or something. After that, they are trained further by your signals that you present. It's a learning network. This you're saying this plot? So this is the learning curve. This is how the error drops with learning. This one. This is a reconstructed time series. Is after the training is over, you just let it generate the signal and show that it matches the train. It reconstructs the training signal well. Yeah, so this is during training. So in training, you repeatedly present the same signals over and over for many epochs, so the reconstruction error goes down. This one. This one. This is after training. Yeah, at different times. Yeah, so because EEG has 64 channels or so. So for each channel, the network output should match that channel's out signal. Yeah. No, why? We don't need any special conditions. The initial phase is close to 0 for all the oscillators. That's the only thing, like some kind of phase initialization condition. That's about it. After that, training takes over. Yeah. Yeah, for the hidden layer. Yeah. No, any hidden layer, standard hidden layer should work. ReLU or sigmoid. Correct. Yes, we can do that, but I don't think that's critical. You can use sigmoid, you can use ReLU or any of those standards. We wanted to show that this general architectures which work in AI, here also, in fact, that's the thing, this combination of oscillators and typical machine learning techniques, seems very powerful. So similarly, for fMRI also, we've done similar exercises. Okay, so there's a lot of other results which, it's in the paper. So next thing is a tonotopic map. So tonotopic map is found in many places in biology, in the animal brains. So this is, for example, in the basal membrane of cochlea. It's a mechanical structure. It's not a neural network, but this does some kind of Fourier transform of the input signal. And another place is auditory cortex of bats. Done many seminal work done by Nobuo Suga and many others. So if you look at the primary auditory cortex, A1 of this particular kind of bat, so you'll find that there's a rectilinear strip along which some kind of Fourier transform is done. Only thing it's not uniform because this particular bat operates in the range of about 60 kilohertz, right, plus or minus a few hertz. So there's a lot of energy concentrated in that zone. So if you look at this strip here, this end it is 100 kilohertz, this end it is 10 kilohertz. That's the range. But in the middle, there's a lot of area given to like a much smaller, like 58 to 62 or something like that. Because that's where a lot of energy is. So how do you model this kind of phenomena? I mean, a general model to model this. So idea is like since the oscillators have a resonance, you can think of creating a map of such oscillators where, right, depending upon which frequencies are more prominent in the input signal, right, you will have them at a higher density in the map. Now, and we know the resonance property of Hopf oscillators. So we took a 2D array of Hopf oscillators. We thought, we didn't worry too much about, after the initial motivation, we didn't worry too much about what happens in biology. We said, let us construct a map where, so let's say the rows denote frequency, and within a row, different oscillators capture different phases of the input signal. To get the concept of phase, we needed some kind of a reference oscillator to define the phase. And so we added that. And after adding that, we felt there's some kind of a vague analogy between, so the map itself looks like cortex, reference oscillator looks like thalamus. So we wanted to think, is thalamus playing that kind of a reference oscillator? Because if you construct oscillators layers like this, you need to have a reference oscillator. I mean, the math demands it. So is that the motivation? Because the thalamus is known for its role in controlling corticothalamic oscillations. So is that the role it's playing? But anyway, it's very too early to make any strong statement on those lines. So we had to modify the previous learning algorithm, learning equations for this. And once the map is trained, you can see that if I give it a single frequency, one whole column gets activated. And if I give that frequency at certain phase with respect to the reference oscillator, within that column, certain oscillators have even higher amplitude, as you can see here. There's a little high, little mount in terms of amplitude. If I give two frequencies, both at different phases again, you can see two columns having higher response. And within each column, again, there's two subsets of oscillators which have higher response. So it is tuned to both frequency and phase. And if you give a more random signal, we give each signal as input, and lots of columns get activated. So it does act like a tonotopic. Again, more details in the paper, and I can share the paper. Then we wanted to try out hardware constructions of such oscillators, and just to capture some biological phenomena, when we picked locomotion. So quadrupeds have very rich locomotor rhythm, so I thought that's a very good phenomenon to replicate. So this work is done by Akhil and Deepan in my lab. So we took the memristor model, which is a oscillator. So this is a what's called VO2 memristor. The conductance has voltage-dependent properties. So we connect that with a constant conductance and a capacitor. This system produces oscillations, as you can see on the right. And we just made a connection between, so if you do phase plane analysis of this oscillator and you can compare it with the Morris-Lecar model. If you interpret the variables in the electronic model with the Morris-Lecar model variables in certain fashion. So now we've said we'll look at all these different locomotor rhythms in quadrupeds. And so this is a circuit we have taken, 4 such memristor oscillators coupled by an array of 4 capacitors. So we showed that by varying the capacitor values, you can reconstruct all these different kinds of locomotor rhythms. Lateral sequence walk, direct sequence walk, trot, pace, canter, gallop, so all of them. And so the final question, which is the starting point of the whole discussion, can we construct general deep oscillator neural networks? That is, the hidden layers are oscillators, just like you have a deep network, and layers should be oscillators. Can you train that? So initially we tried a lot of, lots of, years were spent in trying to figure out a way to make this network work. It was a bad experience. Finally, students said, we'll just put the network on one of these PyTorch kind of software and define the loss function. You figure out how to train the connections. Okay, layers are awesome, and that worked beautifully. So we trying to struggle theoretically to come up with the right equations and theoretically all that, it was very hard. But so with that, so we had this oscillator network. as alternate layers of oscillators and ReLU neurons. Like, somebody was asking, so we use ReLU here. And let's apply this to simple problems like autoencoder. Input, output are the same signal, some random signal. So it matches it very well. So easy problem. Then we wanted to do something like integration. Can it implement integration, right? So assume that the signal is has zero mean so that the signal output doesn't blow up. Take some zero mean signal, a bunch of sinusoids, and it will gain sum of sinusoids, and it learns to perform integration, and some amplitude demodulation, some signal processing problems from cloud communication. It learns all these things. Then more complicated problems from sequence recognition, sequence processing in AI against standard data sets, action recognition. This is a oscillatory convolutional neural network or convolutional oscillatory neural network, right? So it does all this and beats the state-of-art models. Then video frame prediction. So I'm shown a series of frames which has some moving squares and stuff like that. It has to predict the next frame. It learns that. Okay, so and off late, a couple of things are going on in the lab. One is trying to model brain organ interactions, like a heart brain interaction. There's a lot of work out there, a lot of data out there. So basically, we tried to, last summer, there was an intern, and we tried to model ECG rhythm using oscillator network. So we tried very complicated architectures. Finally, what worked is 2 oscillators in the input layer and a bunch of these deep layers, which have sigmoid kind of layers. And it captures the EEG rhythm so beautifully, and then it extrapolates. So the training happens, let's say, from 0 to 10 seconds, and run it further, and then it captures exactly P wave, R wave, Q wave, all that. The structure it has learned, it's able to generalize that. So now we have the whole brain dynamics model, we have the heart dynamics model, we are coupling them in back and forth. There are a lot of data of that kind. Like, for example, there's a person called Catherine Talon-Baudry in Paris. She has a lot of data on this brain organ interaction, brain heart, brain gut, and so on. So we're trying to model those kinds of interactions. One more thing is, strictly speaking, brain signals are not oscillatory, as in brain signals are chaotic, right? They are low dimensional chaos. So ideally speaking, you need deep chaotic neural networks. So we have done that. We just got some results. In fact, I'm not putting slides here. My student who's done some of the work on oscillator networks also done chaotic. They are very good at, for example, resolving very fine differences in frequencies. So like a sine omega t versus sine omega plus delta omega t. Can you classify these two? So it can do that. So we are trying these things, but the big picture here is to come up with, like I said, a kind of grand oscillator theory of brain function, where instead of saying, having all this empirical data, mountains of empirical data, can we have a grand theory? The oscillator theory of spatial navigation and attention and motor function, autonomic control. The oscillations are, a lot of brain disorders associated with impaired oscillations, like epilepsy, for example, like a great example. Parkinson's, right, is called a dynamical disease because the oscillatory activity in subthalamus nucleus, right? So in normal conditions should not be synchronized oscillations. In Parkinson, it becomes synchronized oscillations. So that's one sign of disease. So I think a grand theory would be very, very revealing. It will give a lot of insights into brain function. So what we are thinking about brain is like this. So think of brain as some kind of a communication device, right, or communication environment, like compared with radio communications. Radio communications frequencies use 3 hertz to 300 gigahertz. Because if you use any smaller frequency, then the wavelength becomes much bigger than Earth's diameter and all that. You cannot communicate. If you use very high frequencies, the loss becomes so high that it becomes impractical to transmit. So that gives you a range. So similarly, brain's medium maybe allows efficient usage of only certain band, and nothing less, nothing more will work. So when you give input, right, whatever sensory input comes from different bands, right? You modulate all those different bands into the same narrow band in which brain can operate, and then let it flow through different pathways inside the brain's medium, but all operating within that band. And when you produce output, you're producing, if a hand movement, it's in some frequency. If it is vocal, it's a different frequency band. But that's just by demodulation. So this kind of picture we want to create, like for example, there's a frequency gradient in the brain from anterior to posterior direction. So if I take a arbitrary oscillator network, train it on some sensory motor function, and see how the frequencies have learned in the hidden layers, right? Do you see the same gradient? So these kinds of simulation experiments can give a basis to how brain organizes oscillations right? And that can be easily generalized once you figure it out, right? Generalized to any species and so on and so forth. So thank you very much. And again, there's different students who worked on different aspects of this line of work. Thank you.
One of the issues that one has with deep neural networks is that you are able to reproduce a lot of phenomena, but we don't know why we're able to, in the sense that there's no mechanistic.
Yeah, just like brain. Yeah.
There's a oscillator theory of brain.
Yeah.
Theory.
No, in as much as deep neural networks, right? Do they have a theory?
No, they don't. That's why.
No, I mean, so for example, learning algorithms are derived systematically by minimizing some cost function, and then there is a kind of a recurrent version of that, recursive version of that. I'm talking really old theory. But the newer studies on how the hidden layers are transforming the inputs, and there's a lot of very interesting work going on. Thing is, it's a high dimensional complex network, but look at it in a different angle. In fact, the joke about deep neural networks, there is nothing deep about them. They're so shallow in terms of theory. But look at the impact on the market and society and all. People are scared now that they'll lose jobs. So if you look at that angle of it, they're very sequential.
Justification for it.
No, but what more theory do you want than a demonstration that they work and all the older theories didn't work?
Works.
You have a broad framework beyond that. So I'll tell you what. So you look at early studies on neural networks in the 80s and 90s. People who take a network on some phenomenon, shows it works. Then they probe the hidden layers and show how the hidden neurons behave something like what they found in real brain. So now people don't do that because people said, I don't care. If you ask a Silicon Valley guy, they say, I don't care. But I'll tell you one line of work we are doing with hippocampus and spatial navigation. So look at how experimental, now neuroscience works. So keep on probing hippocampus, an animal does something, runs around in a box or something. Oh, whenever it's in this part of the box, this neuron is firing, so I'll call it a place cell. So this other neuron is firing at many locations. Oh, they form a grid, I'll call it a grid cell. And this neuron fires at this time, so I call it a time cell. And this neuron fires when it sees an object, so I call it an object cell. This neuron fires when it's at a certain angle to the object, I call it object vector cell. Where does it end? You call this theory or what? So whereas if you have a broad framework like this, I train the network and broadly in environment, very general training conditions. Then I probe the network. Network also gives me place cell and grid cell and time cell and whatever. So I don't know. I prefer this kind of a thing than purely empirical experimental study. So that kind of analytic theory maybe is unnecessary or it doesn't exist. Because it's a highly nonlinear system. Yeah. Yeah.
Typically, not to give this out, not very. Secondly, there are effective theories of various kinds. For example, if we actually did normal form analysis, we might give.
Maybe, yeah. So that's where, so in fact, for one of our recent place cell model, we found that the place cell can be explained using Bessel functions. That was the limits of the theory that we could manage, right? So there, if we can join hands, like I said, also this whole problem of z power gamma, a real number. I don't know what will happen if you analyze that construct, right? So that's where I think insights from theoreticians can give. But I feel we have a broad framework. Again, you can say it's still a simulation framework. It's not a theoretical framework. But if you apply some theory to it, we'll have very new methods of analysis and so on. It can be quite exciting.
Going off the brain is not like,
Yeah. Yeah, so.
one state of the.
Sorry, can't hear.
Compare the complete coefficient. Or a brain state, of a brain state, drowsy. Does it give some insight into how the state of the brain is? That they cannot have.
Yeah.
In sense, there's a complete coefficient which fits for a particular brain state.
Yeah, so those two studies, EEG and fMRI, we just took the data and trained the network and reproduced the data. We also show that it extrapolates beyond what is trained. But if you are asking how do you validate it, trying to compare time series is not the best way, because when you say, suppose you say this is a good brain model for waking state, we are not trying to reproduce one particular time series of one person. It should have the spectral properties of the waking state. And those tests we applied, and it does have that. I don't know if I am answering your question. Maybe.
For the state.
Huh?
The complete coefficient of different states tell us something about the
That state. Correct. So, okay, so for that state, those weights, that's what you mean, those weights work for that state. But what we need, if you look at the sleep example, sleep and EEG example, the same network should transition through a bunch of states. For each state, you should produce the right kind of EEG. So that we haven't done. But we are doing that now. That is, there are models of simple sleep generative models. So basically, over a 24-hour cycle, it's a 3-4 variable models people have proposed, David Terman and others. So it will have a 8-hour, 16-hour waking cycle and 8-hour sleep general. Within sleep, there are other variables which will show you like REM and NREM, and you will have like a washing machine cycle, right? 1.5 hour sessions. Those kinds of models can be easily trained again using same oscillators. That will be a sleep generator, like a full-blown sleep. And this will feed into a much larger network which will produce EEG. So this smaller network will set the rhythm for the larger network. And you can produce like a whole brain model for sleep, or like 24 hours with all the states. Now, one application of that kind of a thing is to study insomnia. What happens to these rhythms in people with insomnias? And then how can you intervene? People have all sorts of, I don't know, could be quackery, could be just, I don't know, so if you play certain sounds in both ears and you'll be put to sleep, and I don't know, there's a lot of stuff in the net. I don't even know how you validate it and why it works, if it works at all. So once you have a good simulator of, sleep rhythms, you can try these kind of interventions in the simulation and then give it to the person. You can profile the person's sleeping pattern in terms of such models and then design interventions which are person specific. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.